I'm Rachel, 28, a landscape architect living in a quiet suburb of Pennsylvania. Every Sunday, my mother, Linda, hosts large family dinners that feel more like small-town events. The house fills with the scent of rosemary roast chicken, clinking glasses, and the hum of conversations that always seem to circle back to my older sister, Caroline, who is 30 and a pediatric surgeon. From the moment guests hang their coats on the rack by the door, Caroline becomes the evening's headline. Linda thrives on those dinners, weaving stories of Caroline's long hospital shifts and dramatic life-saving surgeries into every conversation. When Caroline announced her engagement at a family brunch, the room practically vibrated with applause. Cousins passed champagne glasses around, uncles whistled, and even neighbors who'd been invited on a whim crowded in to congratulate her. It's not that I'm invisible, but my mother's praise for me is carefully measured, often wrapped in backhanded remarks. At one dinner, I brought a homemade dessert, and Linda complimented Caroline's perfect soufflé technique while noting my cake looked very store-bought, even though I'd baked it from scratch. My career as a landscape architect is something she calls cute, as if designing entire public parks is a hobby rather than a demanding profession. Still, I keep building my path. When I was promoted to lead a citywide revitalization project, a massive botanical redevelopment that would transform neglected spaces into green havens, Linda barely reacted. At a dinner soon after, I tried to share details about my upcoming work with city planners, but she steered the talk back to the surgical equipment Caroline's hospital had just purchased. My father, Michael, notices these small cuts. He never makes a scene, but he'll quietly remind me, often while drying dishes after everyone leaves, that my designs will improve daily life for thousands of people. His steady presence keeps me grounded. Meanwhile, wedding planning for Caroline became the unofficial theme of every gathering. Each Sunday dinner morphed into a planning session, with Linda spreading color swatches and menu cards across the dining table. Cousins and aunts greeted Caroline first, their eyes shining as they asked about dress fittings and venue tours. I'd slip into conversations where I could, but most nights I ended up in the kitchen refilling pitchers of water, half listening to stories about cake tastings and floral arrangements. Then came a spark I couldn't ignore. A regional magazine featured my latest project on its cover, highlighting the way I'd turned an abandoned rail yard into a vibrant community park. The recognition was more than a personal victory. It was a chance to show my family what I'd been quietly accomplishing. Soon after, the city's mayor invited me to present my vision for the new botanical redevelopment at a public event. The timing was perfect. It landed on the same weekend as the big family reunion Linda had been planning for months. I realized it might be the first time the whole family could see what I do, not just hear a quick summary over dinner. I decided to mention the presentation casually, framing it as a small work event. When I told my parents, Linda barely looked up from her notes for the reunion menu and said something about how the family weekend was already full. I let it go, but quietly invited a few relatives and close friends who I knew might be interested. As the days passed, word spread on its own. Cousin Jenny shared my invitation in the family group chat, and soon aunts and uncles were calling me directly, curious about this small event. Some even adjusted their travel plans to fit both the reunion and my presentation. Linda noticed the sudden shift in everyone's excitement and made a few sharp comments about scheduling conflicts, but I stayed polite and offered no extra details. While she focused on finalizing her reunion agenda, I spent late nights perfecting my display boards, 3D models, and press kits. Michael quietly offered to help with setup without pressing for details, a silent vote of confidence that steadied me. The weekend arrived, and I walked into the City Hall auditorium to find nearly the entire extended family already seated. Linda looked genuinely startled when she saw the size of the crowd, which included city officials and local journalists setting up cameras. When the mayor introduced me as the lead designer for the project, giant screens lit up with before and after visuals of the redevelopment. Gasps and excited whispers moved through the room as the transformation unfolded on screen. Caroline clapped the loudest, her enthusiasm unmistakable. Local reporters lined up for interviews after the presentation, and my relatives watched with bright, proud faces. From the front row, Linda snapped photos and quietly told nearby guests about my work, her voice carrying a pride I hadn't heard before. During intermission, cousins and aunts gathered around me with questions about future projects. Caroline gave me a quick warm hug and joked about being jealous of the media attention. When the mayor presented me with a Civic Leadership Award, the room rose in a standing ovation. Afterward, Michael organized a celebratory dinner at a nearby restaurant. Family members who had barely acknowledged my career before now toasted to my achievements, swapping stories about how they'd seen the city transform through my designs. That night, as conversation flowed easily between Caroline's wedding plans and my botanical project, I noticed something different. For the first time, everyone talked about my work with the same excitement once reserved only for my sister. Linda listened intently, smiling as relatives asked when they could visit the new gardens. It wasn't about stealing anyone's spotlight. It was about finally sharing it, showing them, without a single speech or argument, what I had been building all along. I'm Rachel, 28, and after the night of my big presentation, the days that followed turned into a blur of planning and quiet anticipation. A few mornings later, while my parents were finishing breakfast, I casually mentioned that I had another public event coming up. I described it as a small work thing, something about a new city project that might be interesting if anyone was free. My mother barely looked up from her notes for the family reunion and waved her hand as if to clear the air, saying the reunion would be the real highlight of the weekend. My father gave a small nod, the kind that told me he heard more than he let on. I didn't push it. Instead, I started making my own list of who I wanted to see there. I called a handful of relatives and a few close friends, giving each of them a quiet invitation. I kept the details light, hinting that it would be special, but not explaining how large or important the project had become. The response was immediate, curious pauses, eager voices asking questions I didn't answer. I wanted them to come without expectations, to experience the reveal the same way the public would. Each evening after work, I set up in my apartment with my laptop and the 3D models of the botanical redevelopment. The dining table disappeared under poster boards and press folders. I built the display panels until my hands ached from cutting and taping, then adjusted the miniature trees in the models until they looked alive. I ran through my presentation slides until the timing felt natural, marking every beat of the speech with small notes. My father checked in midweek, stopping by with coffee and an easy smile. He glanced over the models, not asking a single question about what they represented, just offering to help with setup when the day came. That quiet support meant more than anything he could have said aloud. By Thursday evening, the first spark of outside excitement caught fire. Cousin Jenny sent me a screenshot of the invitation she'd shared in the family chat. She added a laughing emoji and a line about how she hoped I didn't mind. Within hours, my phone lit up with messages from aunts and uncles. Some wanted to know if they needed to dress formally. Others asked if it was kid-friendly. I answered each call with the same gentle reassurance. No need for special outfits. Just come and enjoy. Their voices carried a mix of curiosity and anticipation, exactly what I'd hoped for. The next morning, my mother stopped by my apartment unannounced. She noticed the models spread across the table, her eyes narrowing for a moment. She asked if I realized how many people were adjusting their reunion travel plans, then mentioned the scheduling conflict in a tone that sounded more like a warning than a question. I thanked her for letting me know and went back to arranging my boards. Meanwhile, the professional stakes grew higher. The city's event coordinator confirmed that local television crews would attend. The regional magazine that had already featured my previous project scheduled a follow-up interview. I spent an afternoon at the City Hall auditorium, walking the length of the stage, testing the microphone, and checking the projection screens. Every step felt deliberate. The empty seats a quiet reminder of how many eyes would soon be watching. Caroline sent a lighthearted text that evening, a playful warning that I might end up stealing the weekend. She added that she'd be there if her hospital shifts allowed it. The message made me smile. Unlike our mother, Caroline seemed genuinely excited. By Friday, the buzz had escaped the family circle. Local gardening groups began sharing the event details online. A neighborhood civic club posted about it on their bulletin board. None of it came from me, but each notification added a new layer of energy. That night, we gathered for a pre-reunion dinner at my parents' house. The dining room looked the same as always. White candles, polished silverware, and a table loaded with roast chicken and rosemary potatoes. But the air felt different. Conversations broke into side whispers about schedules and arrival times for the presentation. My mother pressed for a final reunion agenda, pausing more than once when she noticed people exchanging glances or checking their phones. I kept my responses calm, confirming the date and time whenever someone asked, thanking them if they said they planned to attend. I didn't reveal the scale of the project or the presence of media crews. The less they expected, the more striking the reveal would be. The final countdown arrived quickly. On Saturday morning, I loaded the display boards and models into the back of my father's car. He met me at the City Hall auditorium to help set up, carrying boxes of brochures while I adjusted the last details of the stage lighting. Volunteers arranged rows of chairs as sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting warm patterns across the polished wood floor. Outside, the buzz grew louder. Families strolled in, carrying reusable coffee cups, their voices bright with weekend energy. Journalists checked equipment near the entrance, testing cameras and setting up tripods. I caught glimpses of familiar faces, cousins I hadn't seen in years, aunts with small children in tow, even a few neighbors from our street. My mother arrived just before the doors opened, her expression unreadable as she took in the scale of the setup. Caroline walked beside her, waving when she saw me near the stage. The crowd swelled until every seat filled, and people lined the walls, chatting while they waited for the program to start. The mayor stepped to the podium and welcomed everyone, his voice carrying easily through the hall. He introduced me as the lead designer of the city's new botanical redevelopment, describing the project as a transformation of abandoned urban spaces into thriving green parks. Applause rippled through the room as I walked forward. The lights dimmed, and the first slide appeared on the massive screen, a barren stretch of cracked pavement. As I spoke, the image shifted to show a vibrant garden with walking paths and fountains. Gasps and murmurs spread through the audience. Each before and after slide drew a new wave of reaction. Caroline clapped with a bright smile, her eyes shining. Reporters moved closer, cameras flashing as I described the design elements and sustainability plans. I caught sight of my mother in the front row, her phone lifted to take photos, a small proud smile breaking through her usual composure. When the presentation ended, the mayor thanked me and invited questions. Hands shot up around the room. Relatives, city officials, curious residents eager to know when the first phase would open. The energy felt electric, every question building on the last. Afterward, reporters approached for quick interviews, their microphones and cameras surrounding me. Family members gathered close, their voices a happy tangle of praise and questions. My father's grin said more than words ever could. As the evening wrapped up, cousins and neighbors made plans to visit the gardens once construction began. Caroline squeezed my arm and whispered about how incredible it all looked. My mother stayed nearby, introducing me to guests as the visionary behind the city's new green spaces. When we finally stepped outside into the cool night air, I realized the weekend had only just begun. The family reunion still awaited, but the balance had already shifted. Everyone now carried the image of what they'd seen, proof of the work I'd been quietly doing all along, and nothing could take that away. I'm Rachel, 28, and the morning after the family reunion kickoff felt like the calm before another storm of activity. I reached the City Hall auditorium before sunrise, long before the first guests were expected. The hall was quiet, except for the sound of stagehands setting up the final pieces of lighting. I walked the aisles, checking every detail, rows of chairs lined in perfect symmetry, soft garden-themed banners hung along the walls, and the giant screens ready for the before and after visuals of the botanical redevelopment. The faint smell of fresh flowers drifted from the arrangements placed near the stage, a last-minute touch I'd requested the night before. As the clock ticked closer to showtime, I spotted my father at the entrance carrying a box of extra brochures. He gave a quick wave and joined the volunteers, helping them stack programs on each chair. The quiet space began to fill with footsteps and voices. First came a few curious neighbors, then city officials with clipboards, and soon the lobby buzzed with the sound of cameras and reporters testing their equipment. Within the next half hour, a flood of familiar faces poured in. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, aunts wearing bright scarves, uncles balancing cups of coffee, and even distant relatives who rarely attended family events. Nearly the entire extended family arrived, far more than I expected, their cheerful greetings mixed with the clicks of camera shutters. My mother entered moments later, pausing at the doorway when she saw the size of the crowd and the professional camera crews mingling with relatives. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the lights, the equipment, and the quiet excitement humming through the audience. I caught a glimpse of Caroline weaving through the crowd with her fiancé. She waved and headed toward the front row, smiling wide when she saw me. Reporters set up near the stage, adjusting tripods and microphones while volunteers guided guests to their seats. The murmur of conversation grew louder as more people filled the hall until every chair was taken and people stood along the back walls. The house lights dimmed and a hush spread over the room. The mayor walked onto the stage, his voice strong and clear as he welcomed everyone. He spoke about the city's commitment to revitalizing neglected spaces and introduced me as the lead designer of the new botanical redevelopment. He highlighted my work transforming urban areas into thriving green spaces, pointing toward the large screens as they flickered to life. The first image appeared, a stretch of cracked pavement and rusted fences, a forgotten corner of the city. As I began to speak, the slide shifted to a vibrant garden filled with winding paths, fountains, and lush greenery. Gasps rippled through the audience. The transformation was striking, and the reaction spread like a wave, soft exclamations, murmurs of surprise, and applause. Caroline clapped enthusiastically from the front row, her excitement unmistakable. Her fiancé leaned forward, clearly impressed by the scale of the project. Camera flashes lit up the room as the slides continued to show every phase of the design. I explained how native plants would reduce water use, how shaded seating areas would invite families to gather, and how the entire redevelopment aimed to bring fresh life to forgotten city corners. Reporters edged closer to the stage, capturing every moment. I moved from slide to slide, pointing out the features and highlighting the partnerships that made it possible. When the final image, a panoramic view of the future garden appeared, the audience burst into loud applause. Local television crews rushed forward with microphones as soon as I stepped away from the podium. They asked about the design process, the timeline, and my inspiration for the project. Cameras clicked and bright lights followed as I answered each question, aware of relatives watching from a few feet away. From the front row, my mother held her phone high, snapping photos and sharing quiet details with guests seated nearby. I overheard her explaining how many years I had worked on urban green space projects, her voice filled with something close to pride. She leaned toward a neighbor and pointed to the screens, smiling as she described the transformation. When the mayor returned to the stage, he called me back for a special moment. He spoke about civic leadership and the importance of sustainable city planning, then presented me with a framed commendation for outstanding environmental innovation. The applause turned into a standing ovation. I saw Caroline on her feet first, clapping hard, her grin wide and proud. During the brief intermission, the space around me filled with family members and city residents eager to talk. Cousins gathered with excited questions about where the first gardens would be planted. Aunts asked about volunteering for the next phase. A few city planners invited me to future meetings to discuss expanding the project. Their enthusiasm made the entire hall feel electric. Caroline found me near the edge of the stage and wrapped me in a warm hug. She laughed about how the media attention might outshine her wedding for a weekend and whispered that she couldn't believe the scale of what I'd created. Her fiancé joined her, offering a handshake and a quick compliment about how breathtaking the designs were in person. Nearby, my mother spoke with a neighbor, her voice carrying just enough for me to catch a few words. She described how proud she was of both her daughters and how exciting it was to see us each succeed in our own way. Hearing that felt like a quiet shift in the air, a change that had taken years to arrive. The event wrapped with another round of applause as guests lingered, reluctant to leave. My father suggested a celebratory dinner and quickly organized a gathering at a nearby restaurant. We moved as a group through the cool evening air, city lights reflecting on wet sidewalks after a light rain. The restaurant buzzed with warmth and chatter when we arrived, the long tables filling quickly with relatives and friends. Plates of pasta and roasted vegetables appeared while servers refilled glasses. Conversations flowed from one end of the table to the other. My cousins debated which park feature would be their favorite once construction began. Caroline shared a few wedding updates while others compared travel plans for the next family gathering. Instead of the usual single focus on her accomplishments, the talk balanced evenly between her wedding and the new gardens. My mother raised her glass in a quiet toast, her eyes sweeping over both Caroline and me. She spoke about family, community, and the pride she felt watching her daughters build lives that mattered. The words were simple, but the meaning landed with weight. The table erupted in clinking glasses and a chorus of cheers. As the night stretched on, relatives continued to ask questions about the redevelopment timeline and future projects. A few joked about hosting the next reunion in the finished garden. Michael collected the evening's menus and photos, tucking them into a folder as a keepsake. When we finally stepped back into the night, the family dispersed in small groups, still buzzing with excitement. Conversations about my work flowed as easily as the wedding plans that once dominated every gathering. For the first time, the attention felt shared, balanced in a way that seemed natural and lasting. Walking back to my car, I noticed the glow from the City Hall windows down the street, where a few lights still burned. The images from the presentation lingered in my mind, bright gardens where cracked pavement once stood, and the sound of my family's applause carried like an echo long after the evening ended. The Monday after the presentation, I stopped by a corner cafe for coffee and spotted the morning paper on the rack. My project filled the front page. A wide photo showed the moment the mayor handed me the Civic Leadership Award, the backdrop glowing with images of the future gardens. The headline stretched across the fold, bold letters announcing the city's commitment to green space. I picked up a copy and saw smaller photos of the crowd, including Caroline in mid-applause and my mother taking pictures from the front row. By the time I reached my office, the article had already made its way across town. Messages filled my inbox from city planners, architects, and residents I barely knew. A call came in from a township a few miles away, asking if I would meet their planning board to discuss similar redevelopment. Another email came from a neighboring city's environmental committee, eager to learn how to replicate the design. The attention spread faster than I expected. Late that afternoon, a delivery arrived at the reception desk, a large bouquet of bright yellow lilies with a handwritten note. Caroline had sent it, the card tucked between the stems with a message about how proud she was and how the presentation had inspired her. The flowers added a fresh scent to the office that carried into the hallway, drawing comments from coworkers who passed by. The next morning, while I organized files for upcoming meetings, a knock sounded at my apartment door. My mother stood there holding a paper bag from a local bakery. She stepped inside, setting down a box of warm pastries. It wasn't a typical visit. She looked around, taking in the neat rows of plans and the framed magazine cover on the wall. After a quiet moment, she nodded toward the newspaper lying on my coffee table and said the coverage was truly impressive. The words were simple, but the shift was unmistakable. Throughout the week, my phone stayed busy with messages from relatives. Cousins sent snapshots of the newspaper article, some circling their own faces in the background of the photos. Aunts left cheerful voicemails about how proud they were and asked when the next event would happen. Each call added another layer of excitement to the days. Midweek, I met with the mayor's advisory board in a tall glass building downtown. The meeting room overlooked the river, sunlight glinting off the water as city planners discussed funding a second large-scale green space project. They asked detailed questions about soil preparation, irrigation systems, and ways to involve local schools in the design phase. The conversation stretched through the morning, ending with an invitation to draft a proposal for the next project. Not long after, I received emails from several school administrators. They wanted me to visit classrooms to talk about urban gardening and sustainable landscape design. One elementary principal asked if I could help their students start a small rooftop garden. The requests came from different neighborhoods, each eager to connect children with the idea of reclaiming city spaces. That evening, Caroline called with an idea. She suggested a joint family dinner to celebrate the project, something informal where everyone could relax and talk without the rush of a public event. We picked a Saturday night and sent a group text to invite everyone. Replies came quickly, cousins adding smiley emojis, uncles confirming they'd bring dessert, and a few friends from my office asking if they could join. On Thursday, my father arrived at my apartment carrying a thick scrapbook. He set it on the table and flipped through pages filled with photos, clippings, and notes from every project I had worked on since college. He had quietly collected them for years without saying a word. The careful arrangement of each page said more than any speech. Meanwhile, at her weekly book club, my mother surprised everyone by sharing the newspaper article and a few of the presentation photos. A neighbor later told me how she spoke with excitement about the project and fielded a dozen questions from curious friends. Word of her enthusiasm reached me before she mentioned it herself, another sign that something had shifted. Toward the end of the week, an email arrived from a private client who owned a large estate on the outskirts of the city. He wanted to hire me to design an ambitious personal garden with water features and rare plant species. The scale of the project sounded challenging, but intriguing, and we scheduled an initial meeting to discuss ideas. Even the small moments carried new recognition. Neighbors in my building stopped me in the lobby to compliment the newspaper article. One elderly couple mentioned they had driven past the proposed garden site just to see the area before construction began. The attention felt both unexpected and energizing. Saturday evening arrived, clear and cool. Our family filled a long table at a lively neighborhood restaurant known for its wood-fired pizza. The warm smell of basil and roasted vegetables drifted through the air as plates arrived one after another. Conversations overlapped, Caroline's wedding updates mixed with questions about the next garden project, and laughter echoed across the table. My mother sat beside me, pointing out details in the newspaper photos to a curious aunt. She asked about the upcoming advisory board proposal and listened closely as I described possible designs for the next phase of city redevelopment. Caroline chimed in with ideas for incorporating native plants into her wedding decor, sparking a side conversation about flower sourcing and local growers. Across the table, cousins debated which part of the botanical redevelopment they wanted to visit first. Once construction began, One uncle suggested bringing a grill to the opening ceremony. Another joked about reserving a family picnic spot in advance. The evening moved quickly, each story sparking another. When the plates were cleared and dessert arrived, my father pulled the scrapbook from his bag and passed it around the table. Everyone leaned in to see the photos and clippings, pointing out moments they remembered from past years. The restaurant's soft lighting reflected off the glossy pages, casting a warm glow over the group. By the end of the night, the conversation flowed easily around my work, as if it had always been a normal topic. It no longer felt like a rare accomplishment needing special introduction. Relatives asked when the next public presentation would be, assuming they'd attend without question. Caroline talked about including a small garden path at her wedding venue, and asked me to sketch ideas before the next family gathering. Walking back to my car under the streetlights, I noticed how natural the evening had felt. My projects had become a steady part of family conversation, something everyone looked forward to hearing about. The quiet shift from surprise to expectation had settled in, woven through every interaction and every shared plan for the months ahead. A week after our family dinner, my phone rang with a call from an editor at a well-known regional lifestyle magazine. They wanted a full feature on the city's botanical redevelopment, and my role in the broader revitalization work. We scheduled a photo shoot and interview for the following Thursday. The photographer arrived early, carrying softbox lights and camera bags, while the writer set up a small recorder on my office desk. They walked with me through the garden plots already breaking ground, snapping pictures as I explained how each section would grow. That same afternoon, an email from City Hall confirmed a major decision. The City Council had voted to expand the project into 2 additional neighborhoods, funding a larger network of green corridors that would connect several districts. The message included a formal request for new design proposals and a tentative timeline for breaking ground in early spring. I printed the approval letter and pinned it to my office board, the first step toward a bigger transformation. 2 days later, a thick cream envelope arrived in the mail. Caroline's engagement party invitations were inside, embossed with gold lettering and a watercolor illustration of a farmhouse surrounded by trees. The date was set for a Saturday evening in midsummer. I read the details twice, remembering how family attention had balanced out recently and wondering if the upcoming party might shift the focus back toward her. That weekend, I stopped by my parents' house for coffee. My mother greeted me at the door and, before mentioning anything about wedding plans, asked how the new expansion would change the design work. She listened as I explained the council's vote, nodding and asking small but thoughtful questions. Only after a few minutes did she mention table settings for Caroline's party. The order felt different, my work first, wedding details second. On Monday morning, a new email stood out among the messages in my inbox. A national environmental nonprofit invited me to present at their annual conference in Chicago. They wanted a keynote address about large-scale city green spaces and sustainable community planning. The conference drew experts from across the country, and the invitation included travel and lodging arrangements. I confirmed the date and added it to my calendar, aware that it would happen just a few weeks after Caroline's party. The evening of the engagement celebration arrived with warm weather and a clear sky. The restored farmhouse sat on a gentle hill outside town, its wide porch strung with soft lights. A trio of musicians played acoustic guitar near the entrance, while servers carried trays of sparkling drinks. Guests mingled on the lawn as the scent of roasted vegetables and herbs floated from the open kitchen windows. Caroline stood near the front steps in a light blue dress, greeting each arrival with a hug. Her fiancé stayed close, shaking hands and guiding relatives toward the tables set under a canopy of lanterns. When I stepped onto the lawn, cousins waved from across the yard, and a group of aunts surrounded me almost immediately. They asked about the expanded garden project, wanting to know when the first groundbreaking would take place, and how they could volunteer. The conversation flowed with questions about native plants, community workshops, and the magazine photo shoot scheduled for later in the week. Caroline's fiancé joined us and asked about the new city council approval, remarking on how ambitious the designs looked in the newspaper sketches. He talked about how he and Caroline hoped to incorporate some of the botanical themes into their backyard once they bought a house. His easy praise drew more relatives into the discussion, and for several minutes the talk centered on the gardens and the upcoming national conference before anyone mentioned wedding details. Inside the farmhouse, tables held platters of roasted salmon, fresh salads, and handmade breads. A local baker had created a towering cake with edible flowers that matched the farmhouse decor. Musicians shifted to livelier tunes as people filled plates and moved in and out of the main hall. I joined a circle of cousins on the porch, answering more questions about the design expansion and the Chicago keynote invitation. Later in the evening, Caroline tapped her glass to gather everyone's attention. She thanked the guests and shared a short story about how she and her fiancé met, drawing warm laughter from the crowd. When the applause settled, she surprised me by adding a note of appreciation for my work on the city gardens, saying she hoped to borrow some of my ideas for the wedding day itself. Guests turned toward me with smiles, and another round of clapping followed, blending seamlessly into cheers for the couple. As the night stretched on, the balance between wedding celebration and conversation about the gardens felt natural. Groups shifted between dancing inside and chatting on the lawn. My mother moved easily among guests, introducing me to friends of Caroline's fiancé as the visionary behind the city's new gardens, a phrase she repeated often enough that it became a kind of refrain. When the music slowed near midnight, lanterns flickered gently in the breeze, and guests began to gather their things. Caroline's fiancé offered one more handshake and said he hoped to see the expanded gardens as soon as the first phase opened. My parents lingered near the porch steps, exchanging goodbyes with relatives while I helped Caroline pack leftover desserts into small boxes for guests to take home. Driving back through quiet roads lined with tall trees, I replayed the evening's easy flow of conversation. Wedding plans and city projects had shared the spotlight without competing. The farmhouse lights faded in the distance as the road opened toward the city, and the night settled into a calm hum of possibility. The weeks after Caroline's engagement party filled quickly with plans and invitations. I set aside long evenings to build a new presentation for the National Environmental Conference in Chicago. My office floor disappeared under rolled blueprints, digital renderings, and notes on irrigation methods. Slides came together showing each stage of the city's green space expansion, with maps that highlighted how neighborhoods would connect through new gardens. As the presentation took shape, messages arrived from community centers across the city. Several asked if I could lead weekend workshops on garden planning and environmental care. They wanted sessions on composting, native planting, and small-scale green roofs. I scheduled a series of Saturday events, each one set in a different neighborhood to involve as many residents as possible. One sunny morning, I drove to my parents' house for coffee and found my mother on her knees in the backyard, digging a neat row of small holes. Bags of soil and wooden planks leaned against the fence. She had decided to start a garden of her own, inspired by the city project. She asked me to help plan the layout and choose plants. My father joined us outside, carrying a hammer and joking that our yard had become a pilot project for the city gardens. He helped her build raised beds, leveling each corner while she measured spacing for herbs and flowers. By evening, the first rows of soil stood ready for planting, and we marked spots for tomatoes, peppers, and a small patch of lavender. Meanwhile, Caroline finalized her wedding venue, an outdoor estate with sweeping lawns and tall oak trees. She called to ask if I would create a floral installation for the ceremony entrance. I agreed, and we set a weekend to shop for plants and decor. That Saturday, we spent hours at a large nursery just outside town. We compared rows of flowering vines, choosing wisteria and climbing roses for an archway. We walked through aisles of ferns and hydrangeas, debating colors for table arrangements. At the end of the day, we loaded the car with trays of seedlings and decorative lanterns, laughing as we fit everything into the trunk. Around the same time, a producer from a popular gardening podcast reached out. They wanted an episode about urban revitalization and asked me to share the story of the city project from start to finish. I recorded the session one quiet evening in my office, describing how abandoned lots could become public spaces. The episode aired the following week and drew messages from listeners across the country, some offering ideas and others asking for advice on starting similar projects. The city also planned a formal recognition ceremony to honor contributors to public spaces. The mayor invited me to City Hall, where officials presented a plaque for environmental leadership. Photographers captured the moment as applause filled the chamber. Local news outlets ran brief segments that evening, showing clips of the ceremony alongside images of the gardens under construction. Not long after, my mother hosted her book club for a luncheon in the backyard. The new raised beds, already sprouting herbs, made a perfect setting. She placed copies of the lifestyle magazine featuring my interview on each table, and shared stories about the conference invitation and the city expansion. Guests asked questions while sampling pastries, and she answered with bright details, clearly enjoying every moment. A week later, an unexpected email arrived from a nearby university's Department of Landscape Architecture. They offered me a part-time lecturing position to teach a course on sustainable urban design. The invitation included a flexible schedule to accommodate ongoing projects. I met with the department chair to discuss curriculum ideas and agreed to start with a short seminar series in the fall. Caroline surprised me one evening with an early gift, a sleek leather portfolio designed to carry large design plans. She handed it to me with a wide grin, saying it would be perfect for the conference and for all the proposals I'd be carrying between city meetings. The thoughtful gesture fit neatly into the steady support she had shown in recent months. With so many new events on the calendar, we decided to plan a family getaway. We chose a lakeside town a few hours away and booked a long weekend to celebrate both the progress of the gardens and Caroline's upcoming wedding. My father found a small rental cottage with a wraparound porch and a view of the water. The plan included quiet mornings by the lake and evening meals in the town's small restaurants. During calls to finalize the trip, my mother spoke with friends and neighbors, sharing balanced praise for both her daughters. She described Caroline's wedding plans with the same enthusiasm she used for the expanding gardens. Neighbors mentioned later how proud she sounded of us both, a balance that had slowly become part of every conversation. On a quiet Sunday evening before the getaway, I gathered with my parents and Caroline for dinner at their house. We ate outside near the new garden beds, now alive with young plants. My mother pointed out the first tiny sprouts of basil, while my father lit candles along the patio. I thanked them for their constant encouragement and for helping at every turn, from the first presentation to the ongoing projects. Caroline raised a glass, smiling as she spoke about how much she valued our weekends of plant shopping and late-night planning sessions. As the evening wound down, I packed the new portfolio with notes for the Chicago conference and double-checked travel plans for the family trip. The house glowed with soft light as we said goodnight, the scent of freshly turned soil drifting from the garden beds. The rhythm of work, family, and shared celebration felt steady now, a natural part of our days as new projects and wedding details moved forward side by side. I arrived in Chicago on a crisp morning with my portfolio tucked under one arm and a schedule packed from dawn to dusk. A driver from the conference met me at the airport and handed over a badge that listed me as a headline speaker. The hotel lobby buzzed with visitors carrying posters and rolled-up charts, conversations overlapping about green energy and city planning. The next day began with a networking breakfast in a sunlit ballroom filled with long tables. Urban planners from New York compared notes with sustainability experts from Portland and San Francisco. I joined a group discussing stormwater gardens, sharing details about the raised bed systems we used back home. Business cards traded hands as servers refilled coffee cups and set out trays of fresh fruit. By mid-morning, staff guided me to a large auditorium for the keynote session. Rows of seats filled quickly, the soft hum of conversation fading as the lights dimmed. I stepped onto the stage as the screens behind me lit with the opening slide. A barren lot transformed into a thriving green park. I spoke about soil restoration, native planting, and how to involve local communities so they feel true ownership of public spaces. The images shifted with each point, cracked pavement replaced by winding paths, gray walls hidden behind vertical gardens. When the final slide appeared, the room erupted in an extended standing ovation. The applause rolled across the hall like a wave, cameras flashing from several rows. Organizers lined the side aisle, smiling as attendees rose to their feet. Reporters gathered the moment I stepped down. Environmental journalists and podcasters formed a loose circle, microphones and recorders ready. Questions came rapid fire about funding models, plant selection for harsh climates, and plans for future projects. Photographers snapped pictures as I explained the process behind every design choice. Near the end of the interviews, a tall woman approached wearing a badge from a European design consortium. She introduced herself and explained that her organization was launching a major city garden initiative overseas. She invited me to submit a proposal for one of their flagship projects, handing me a card with her direct contact details and a handwritten note about the timeline for applications. Back home, my phone vibrated with messages even before I left the auditorium. My father, Michael, sent a photo of our living room filled with neighbors and relatives. He wrote that Linda had arranged a watch party to stream the keynote on a big screen. In the background of the picture, I could see my mother standing near the television, hands raised mid-gesture as she explained the design slides to guests. Later that evening, Caroline called, her voice full of laughter. She described how her mother had practically given her own presentation during the stream, explaining every project detail to anyone who would listen. Neighbors had gathered in clusters, asking questions while Linda proudly described each phase of the gardens. The conference closed with a dinner in a grand banquet hall decorated with cascading ivy and soft lights. Toward the end of the meal, the organizers surprised me by announcing the Emerging Environmental Innovator Award. They presented a crystal plaque etched with the conference logo while the audience stood and applauded again. Photos flashed as I stepped forward to accept the award, shaking hands with the director and thanking the team. When I returned home 2 days later, my family planned a quiet dinner at my parents' house. Relatives and a few close friends filled the kitchen with cheerful voices, and the smell of fresh basil from my mother's new garden. Plates of roasted vegetables and lemon chicken lined the table while glasses clinked in small toasts. Conversations shifted easily between Caroline's wedding plans and the international project invitation, each topic drawing equal excitement. During dessert, I rolled out sketches for Caroline's final wedding design. The plan featured an outdoor arch covered in native flowers and sustainable decor made from repurposed wood and natural fabrics. Caroline leaned over the table, tracing each section with her finger while relatives nodded in approval. We scheduled the installation day and divided tasks for arranging the plants and lanterns. The following weekend, Linda hosted her book club in the backyard. The raised beds had flourished under her care, basil and lavender filling the air with their scent. She led her friends along the paths, pointing out each plant and proudly explaining that I had guided the layout. Guests admired the neat rows and asked about her watering schedule, and she answered with a confidence that matched her new hobby. Later that night, Caroline and I took a slow walk through the neighborhood. We passed houses with porch lights glowing and talked about the busy months ahead, her wedding, the next city project, and the proposal for the European initiative. The cool air carried the scent of late summer flowers as we mapped out tasks for the coming weeks. Back at my apartment, I spread the European Consortium's materials across my desk. Application guidelines, project photos, and timelines covered the surface as I began drafting the proposal. I made notes about sustainable water systems and community gardens that could adapt to a different climate. At the same time, I kept a separate folder for Caroline's wedding installation plans, double-checking delivery dates for the climbing roses and lanterns. Each day blended professional work with family plans. Morning calls with city officials shifted into evening conversations about wedding decor. My mother sent updates on her garden's growth. Tomatoes ripening faster than expected. Lavender attracting more bees than she'd planned. Michael emailed a short video of the neighborhood children exploring the garden beds, laughing as they discovered tiny green sprouts. As the proposal draft took shape, the house stayed filled with reminders of how much life had changed. The sound of my mother's voice on family calls carried the same pride for both Caroline's wedding and my international project. Friends and neighbors now asked about the gardens as naturally as they once asked about Caroline's hospital shifts. The balance felt steady when we gathered again for Sunday dinner. Conversation moved easily between topics: travel plans for the wedding, the next steps for the European proposal, and the fall schedule for my university lectures. My father raised a glass to the months ahead, listing each milestone: Caroline's ceremony, the next city garden opening, and the possibility of work overseas. The evening ended with laughter and the warm smell of herbs drifting from the backyard. As I packed my notes for the proposal and the wedding designs, I watched my mother adjust the lanterns along the garden path, her smile bright in the fading light. The quiet moment held everything that had grown around us: projects, celebrations, and a family that now celebrated every success with the same full-hearted pride.